Good morning, and you are here with a typical Christian, and I will be providing a critique on Theoretical Bullshit's Treatise on Morality. This is my first video, so the quality might be a little janky, so bear with me. But my critique is going to come in three parts. First, I'm going to critique Theoretical Bullshit's definition of morality, and more specifically, I'm going to critique the way of measuring it that he touched briefly on, but the idea of you can tell whether or not someone's happy or whether or not someone's sad, and that is how you're going to measure whether or not an action is moral, if it makes someone happy, or in a sense it increases well-being, or if it makes someone sad or hurt. In other words, it increases unnecessary suffering. And specifically, he talked about using neural imaging, things like EKGs, things like fMRIs, PET scans, those sort of things. You can see what parts of the brain are active when someone is experiencing joy or when someone's experiencing sadness. So I'm going to first critique the definition itself and critique the way of measuring whether or not an action is moral. Second, I will talk about, regardless of whether or not you believe this is a valid definition of morality, I will talk about how it is not sufficient to draw an ought when it comes to whether or not you should be moral. And that is one of the claims Theoretical Bullshit said he was going to show. He would not only show that I can get an objective morality, but I will show that you ought to behave that way. And I am going to rebut that. And third and finally, I will talk about what a science of morality really does and some of the consequences of it. Well, more specifically, one consequence of it. Okay, number one, I'm going to critique the definition that Theoretical Bullshit gives of morality and the way of measuring it, that being measuring neural firing, or using neural imaging techniques like fMRIs, EKGs, so on and so forth. And I'm going to sort of start out of order. I'm going to first talk about the way you want to measure increased well-being or increased unnecessary suffering. If we say the way we're going to measure whether or not someone's well-being has increased, like essentially, let's see if they're happy by taking a PET scan or an fMRI or an EKG. The claim I want to make is doing this thus makes certain actions that we would consider amoral and sometimes even immoral moral. And the example I'm going to use is drug use. And first I'll start talking with marijuana. While some people out there would say, yes, marijuana use is immoral, I would personally say it's an amoral decision. It's recreational. It's not particularly harmful, but I'm not trying to promote marijuana. But anyway, what you will see when someone uses drugs or intakes drugs, you will see increase in certain neurotransmitters, which is also related to things like being happy. You can see increases in dopamine, increases in other neurotransmitters that relate to whether or not someone's happy or whether or not, in this case, their well-being has increased. So when someone uses marijuana, you see increases in like THC levels, which is related to certain bliss feelings, or that actually might be the cannabinoid neurotransmitters. But point being, if someone uses marijuana and you took a PET scan or an EKG or an fMRI, you would see similar lighting up. You would see similar brain areas being activated as if their well-being had increased, or if they're happy, or if they're blissful. And while I would say that, as I said before, this isn't immoral, I would say it's amoral. But given these definitions of morality and immorality, an action is moral if it increases well-being, and we measure that by things like neural imaging, I would say we would have to conclude that marijuana use is a moral action. It is moral to use marijuana, and most people would say it's either immoral or amoral. And so there's some inconsistency there with how people generally feel and how we're measuring things. And you could say this with any sort of recreation, like playing sports. You're happy when you do that. Most people consider these things amoral. They don't really have a moral value. We don't consider having fun to be really a moral dilemma or a moral sort of situation. But once again, we can talk about, and furthermore, we can talk about other drugs like crack cocaine. You'll see certain things light up in the reward pathway, and so we would say, oh, this must be moral as well. When a lot of cases it can be detrimental, and so you would say, I guess what you could say is the beginning of using these drugs increases well-being, so at first it becomes moral, and later when you see addiction and harmful things, it becomes immoral. And so there's this just sort of a funky way of trying to say, oh, this action's moral because these parts of your brain light up, this action's immoral because these parts of your brain light up. Because you can have different situations that we don't consider moral activate certain parts of your brain that we would see when you have certain emotional experiences. And secondly, what I want to say about this idea of measuring or defining morality as an action is moral if it increases well-being, it's immoral if it increases unnecessary suffering, or it does both, is it becomes utilitarian in a sense. And so the idea that it's only wrong if you get caught becomes more applicable. Say you are in a relationship, but you decide to have an affair. If your significant other doesn't find out about the affair, there's no unnecessary suffering. And if you're happy and your mistress is happy, then this action becomes moral. While most people would say, regardless of whether or not you get caught, if you carry on an affair, it's immoral. But now we will go to my second point, that even if we ignore these sort of criticisms about this definition of morality or this way of measuring morality, it is not sufficient enough to give us an ought when it comes to acting moral. So number two, in a way what TBS is trying to argue is that we can determine morality or moral actions, or whether or not an action is moral or immoral, through reason. We can use rational oughts to get to a pragmatic and useful idea of morality. But what I would want to say is, even if I do grant your premise that this type of objective morality works, which I don't, but for the sake of argument, let's say this does work. You have come up with an objective morality. I would say you yet to provide an ought of why I should do this. Even if we say morality is based on reason, I could always say, well, why should I be rational? Why should I always listen to my reason? And someone would say, wait, that doesn't make sense. But I could say, if you're saying morality is based on rationality, I would say, couldn't I choose against rationality? Why do my priorities have to be such that my main concern is being a moral person? In the idea of being religious, we can talk about the idea that while morality is important, what is more important to the religious person is, well, obedience to God. And it's not so much I am unethical, but my priority isn't the ethical realm. And we can take certain stories like the story of Abraham. While I believe he felt as though the outcome was going to be his son was going to be alive, Isaac wasn't going to die, he was not concerned about doing the ethical thing. He was concerned about doing the religious thing. And people will say, well, that's immoral, that's wrong, that's evil. But while that becomes your own personal opinion, you say, I wouldn't have done it because I'm more concerned about living ethically. And I myself would say, yes, a lot of times I'm more of an ethical person than I am a religious person. But you can't say that living in the religious realm of things is inherently worse than living in the ethical realm of things. It all depends on what your desired outcome is. Underlying all of this is the assumption that the ethical way of life is the way of life you ought to live. And that's something you can't take for granted. Okay, point three, my third and final point. This idea of science of morality or morality as a science in a lot of ways can be problematic. I'm going to talk about one way, or what I think is the most important way it can be problematic. this idea of we can figure out whether or not an action is moral or whether or not an action is immoral just by sort of applying these rules of science that we applying certain theories of morality. What it does is it sort of strips away personal choice from the individual. It sort of takes something that's very subjective, very personal, very much drawn on by emotions, by passions, and it sort of makes it a bit more mundane and makes it more calculative. You just have to calculate what action you should do. And this, it sort of gets this idea of like trying to enslave people's free choice. And that's the biggest problem I have with it. This idea that there's only really one right option for what you should do here. This is the moral option, this is the immoral option. You not only should, but you ought to choose the moral option. The idea of when someone sacrifices their life for someone else, you lay down your life for your friend. This idea that you need to calculate whether or not your family suffers more or your friend's family suffers more to see whether or not what you're doing is really moral, it just sort of kills this idea of, well, why'd you do that? Why don't you lie? Why are you so honest? Why do you do this? Why do you do that? It's like, well, this is the kind of person I want to be. It's not so much, well, science says that this is the right way to go, so I went this way. There's this idea that a lot of the choices we make aren't based on reason. It's based on emotion. It's based on passion. It's based on our desired outcome, what we want to see happen. Like, one of the biggest sort of ethics in the Christian theology is this idea of love your neighbor as yourself. Not so much do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but sort of you have this concern for everyone, which we're not going to get into how plausible that is, but this idea that you have this sort of concern you have for your fellow man, all of them, as you would yourself. And that idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, as one of my favorite philosophers put it, is that in essence what that means is you love your neighbors as much as you love your loved ones. Because in a sense, your friends and your family are, as Aristotle said, your other self. So this idea that you probably will never get there, but you try to sort of love everyone with the same regard as you would have for your mother or your wife or your husband or your girlfriend or your best friend, so on and so forth, isn't rational in any sort of way, but it's something that it draws a lot of people. It pulls at this sort of idea of, I want to see a better world, and I feel as though this might help. Or the idea of loving your enemies as yourself is very irrational, and in some people could argue it's immoral if we use this sort of idea of increased well-being, increased suffering. There are a lot of things you do that can hurt you that we consider sort of self-sacrificial. We can talk about things like the civil rights movement, as there was a lot of suffering, but people did this because it was the right thing to do. But someone could argue, well, people are going to get hurt, you shouldn't do this, this is immoral. And if we had this science of morality then, they would say, well, we've done the calculations, you shouldn't do this, it causes too much suffering, there's not enough well-being being produced, therefore it's immoral. But that's not how we as humans act. When it comes to morality, it's based on passion, it's based on our desired outcomes, it's based on emotions, which a lot of people try to say, well, it's just your subjective opinion, that's just your emotions. But I would say those are a far more powerful thing than people realize. And when it comes to talking about morality, I'm going to refer anyone watching this video to the Amazing Atheist video. It's titled, I think it's The Death of Morality and the Anarchy of the Soul. I guess I'm arguing more for a more relativistic point of view. He argues more for an amoralist point of view. It's a really good video. He can probably explain a lot of these ideas better than I can, and there'll be less stuttering and it'll be much better quality video. So I'm going to leave a link to that below, and we're going to wrap up here.